Dear ladies, gentlemen, colleagues, friends, a warm welcome and thank you for taking time and joining the webinar about the International Pandemic Treaty in search of the Holy Grail for pandemic preparedness and response. My name is Theresa Krüger. I had the privilege to be the youth delegate to the 74th World Health Assembly last year, and I'm also a member of the youth stakeholder group within the Global Health Hub Germany. First of all, the terrible war in Eastern Europe, of course, concerns and affects us all somehow. It seems like, if I can say so, a black hole absorbing all political attention in the moment, which is understandably. Nevertheless, the pandemic is far from over and it might not be the last one. That's why today's discussion is very much needed, and I'm looking forward to it. This event today is hosted by the Global Health Hub Germany, and the hub is a network representing over 1,500 diverse members from 8 different stakeholder groups, which makes it a great platform for discussion of this priority in the light of the current international debates. You may already be familiar with the Global Health Hub, and if not, you can check out the website of the hub for further information and eventually become a member if you wish. So before we start, some words on housekeeping so that we ensure a pleasant environment during this webinar. As you know, since registration, this event will be recorded. We kindly ask all participants to mute their microphones and also to deactivate the video function. But nevertheless, we kindly invite you to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, your organization, to see who is spending the next 1.5 virtual hours with us during this cloudy afternoon, at least in Germany. You can participate in the discussion by posting your questions or comments in the chat during the whole panel, and we will discuss them later in the Q&A part. Now, a small leap in time. On the 1st of December 2021, the World Health Assembly convened in a special session where they decided to start an official negotiating process that should lead to a pandemic treaty. That means a legally binding instrument under the auspices of the World Health Organization. Developing and adopting a legally binding instrument is quite exceptional in the history of the WHO. Among the few exceptions are the International Health Regulations and the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, FCTC, which you certainly both know. In the process so far, it has been stressed that it is crucially important to include non-state actors in the negotiations as well, what we are trying to do today also. But there are, of course, many open questions. What will the pandemic treaty look like? How could it be implemented? What should it include? How will non-state actors be meaningfully involved in the process? And so to inform you about what is already known and to kick off a dialogue about the ideal form and content of the pandemic treaty, the Global Health Hub organizes this online discussion with 2 speakers highly involved in the development process. And I'm really glad to have them here with us today. First of all, I welcome Stephen Solomon, who is the Principal Legal Officer of the WHO Secretariat in Geneva. And he's also a key person in the work on a pandemic treaty, as well as in the work on amending the IHR. And taking the German perspective, we welcome Björn Kümmel, who is the acting head of Unit on Global Health Policy at the German Federal Ministry of Health. And he's also served as vice chair of the executive board and as a chairman or was chairman of the Programs, Budget and Administration Committee of the executive board. And currently he's the chair of the WHO Working Group on Sustainable Financing, also really important. So I'm glad to have you both here with me. And in the next 25 minutes, I'd like to discuss some key aspects with you regarding the development process so far, form, as well as content of the pandemic treaty, before I open the floor for questions from the audience. And please, everyone, feel free to send your questions via the chat for this Q&A. So now I've spoken long enough, let's get started. Stephen, I would like to ask you to set the scene a little bit for us. The idea of a pandemic treaty has been discussed since it was first mentioned in November 2020 by Charles Michel. What were the considerations for WHO member states to decide upon starting an official negotiation process for a pandemic treaty? And playing a bit the devil's advocate, I would say we already have the IHR. Why do we need a new instrument at all?
Theresa, first of all, let me thank you for the introductions and thank you for your opening remarks. Can you hear me well? Great. You know, you pointed out the very sort of difficult geopolitical circumstances in which we are all meeting these days. WHO is paying an extraordinary attention to these events. We are also mindful that there are many other crises of humanitarian significance around the world, which we continue to pay attention to, all of which concern WHO and its member states, all of which look at this through the lens of ensuring that there is ongoing protection of health facilities, health workers, medical missions. This is of utmost importance as we speak, and we may have time to get into some of the possible implications of the geopolitical polarization on some of the work that we're talking about, and I'm happy to do that. But I really wanted to also stress how much we appreciate the interest in these issues and what we're going to talk about today from all of your audience who are tuning in and those who may tune in later. You know, I'll start out with a quote from the Constitution of the WHO, which has an extraordinary preamble written in 1946 when the drafters of the WHO Constitution, mindful of the horrendous impacts of World War II, got together and in 6 months produced an extraordinary document known as the WHO Constitution and talked about the importance of public engagement in 1946. They wrote, and I'll share this with your listener, in preamble paragraph 8, an informed opinion and active cooperation on the part of the public are of the utmost importance to the improvement of the health of the people. Those words, which might even sound somewhat hyperbolic, are so true and could not be truer today, more so true today than ever. The importance of engagement on the part of the public, and informed public, informed on the basis of science and evidence, is absolutely critical to public health and to response, both in so-called peacetime of public health and in times of public health crises and emergencies. So thank you so much for basically living that preambular principle of the WHO Constitution. But now in answer to your question, why isn't the IHR good enough? Why is all this talk about another instrument, a pandemic treaty? And the answer is that the IHRs, as important as they are, were built for a problem on a different scale. It surprises people when I tell them this, that the word pandemic does not appear in the IHR. So the IHRs were written in the aftermath of the SARS epidemic and the impacts that we have seen with COVID-19 were just not in the scope of things for the negotiators. Experts and WHO were aware of what the implications of pandemic could have on every aspect of society and every sector of society and every aspect of our lives. But it really is something that the world has learned in the last 2+ years about the scale and scope and depth and reach of the impact of these, which is why there is such interest now in a new instrument for pandemic preparedness and response, and for ensuring resiliency of our societies and of our economies. And
Thank you for the opening words, also for mentioning the WHO Constitution and also reminding us about the importance of civil engagement, Stephen. It's also really surprising to learn that pandemic doesn't even appear in the IHR. So my next question goes to Björn. From the outset, the German government was a leading advocate for a pandemic treaty. I wonder, why is this, and what has Germany done to drive the process to where it is now, and how is this also linked with our global health strategy?
So first of all, thanks, Theresa, for that question, and thanks a lot for the Global Health Hub Germany for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to exchange here with the broader global health colleagues, obviously civil society, which I think is crucial also in this process. One of the key aspects that we highlight in the German strategy on global health is that civil society plays a crucial part and needs to be vocal and heard in all relevant processes in global health. And one of the key processes that will potentially involve many of us for the next 2 years or even beyond is this exercise, this common learning exercise of the pandemic treaty. So I think it's of utmost importance to hear the views and voices from civil society and to bring all perspectives in and to also advocate for specific themes and make us member states aware of what needs to be tackled. So indeed, Germany was from the outset a key protagonist in this exercise. I think it's fair to say that from a German point of view, the current crisis may be seen as one of the greatest crises that mankind has experienced within the last 70 years, I would say. And as Steve was already alluding to, one of the outcomes of after the Second World War was obviously the creation of lots of the UN and also the WHO itself, and the moment of the Bretton Woods moment. And many of us referred to a new Bretton Woods moment for global health after this crisis. I think it's fair to say that the German government, also before the COVID crisis came up, had lots of priorities, but one of them certainly was trying to make sure that we are best prepared for the next crisis to come. And that certainly is one lesson to be learned from the West African Ebola crisis, where the global community potentially knew what lessons should have been implemented, but failed to implement the key lessons. And we are, at this moment, it remains to be seen whether the global community has learned from this major failure and shortcoming to truly prepare the world for the next crisis to come. After one pandemic is before the next pandemic, we know that pandemics will further come. They might be as harmful or even worse than COVID. So we need to ensure that we are all best prepared and leave no one behind. So I think that's, from the outset, was one key priority for the German government, even before COVID came up. I think for us, it's also, and that has also been clear throughout responding to this crisis, is that we are lacking legal clarity with regards to member states' obligations, with regards to ensuring a best coordinated response, with regards to lots of things, be it equity, be it compliance, be it data and virus sharing, be it financing the response, and obviously the governance issues. Maybe 2 more things, or even 3 more things. This pandemic treaty was proposed obviously by Charles Michel and by potentially the Chilean president. It's a little bit unclear who was the first one, but it was certainly promoted by all independent panels, in particular the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response and the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. And now we could go on naming lots of different panels, but I think those are the 2 essential ones. And the global community mandated those experts to clarify to us what is needed after this crisis in order to be best prepared. And I think that's certainly one issue where we are trying to push as hard as possible in order really to arrive at a legally binding instrument. And the other part is the political momentum after each crisis diminishes quite quickly. And we are seeing that already now due to the crisis that you have alluded to at the very start. Obviously, the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical crisis, and obviously the severe situation that millions of people find themselves in currently. And maybe the last aspect why Germany has been one of the key promoters of this. Germany is a strong promoter of a constructive multilateralism. One foundation of multilateralism, I guess, from my point of view, the pillar of multilateralism is legal clarity, legal rules that apply to all member states. So a rules-based architecture, global health architecture, based on common rules that we set for all of us together for situations that might lie in the future. So to me, that is one key pillar, and Germany is and remains a strong promoter of multilateralism and the pandemic treaty.
Thank you for the first insights. I think it's always good to keep in mind the results from the independent panels that were really crucial for the whole process, and also for reminding us that this might not be the last pandemic, though no one is eager to hear that, but it is important. Now I would like to move on to form and content, since we know that the form of a possible treaty is important for the future course. So I would like to ask Stephen, under which WHO provisions could the treaty be adopted, and what are the differences with respect to legal obligations for member states, accountability and compliance?
Thanks, Theresa, for that question. So a bit of background. This is exactly, first of all, this is exactly the question that member states will decide by the end of July. So it's right around the corner. In the view of many, my personal view, but I'm somewhat nerdy about this, this is more riveting than any Netflix series to see what member states will do come July. So I invite all of your viewers and listeners to stay tuned and stay engaged. There is going to be informing this decision that member states will take on the provision, on the form of the instrument. There will be public hearings on the 12th and 13th of April that we are planning now, and they will be truly public. Anyone can participate, can send a written submission with what they think should be in this instrument or this treaty, and then whether it will be legally binding or not is right around the corner. That decision has to be made according to the special session of the Health Assembly, which just recently took place. That decision has to be made by member states, by the 194 countries, members of WHO, by the end of July. So their choices are, in a sense, binary, as you pointed out, either legally binding or not legally binding. But within that binary, let me unpack that just for a moment, because I think your audience may find this interesting, especially with the legally binding part. Within that legally binding part, there's two options. There's one option, which is a conventional treaty. That's the kind of treaty everyone really knows about. That's what countries take back to their parliaments and they consider, and one by one they ratify, and there's a signing ceremony, and there's a whole process for each country, one by one, to opt into that treaty. And you were also right when you said at the beginning, it hasn't gotten much use. It's only been used one time, and that's for this thing called the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. That was done as a regular treaty. It's now got, I think, 182 or so parties. Each one subscribed to it, got themselves bound to it one by one. Normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill treaty, but a great thing, obviously. Then there is a very interesting tool that this WHO Constitution that we referred to provides countries within the WHO. And this is extremely unusual. The UN doesn't have this tool. The UN is a separate international organization. We have a special relationship with them, but they're separate. They have the UN Charter with the WHO Constitution that forms us. There's a special tool in WHO, very rare, that allows countries to agree on another legally binding form. And that's what you referred to when we talked about the international health regulations. And they work through an opt-out provision, meaning countries don't have to one by one sign up. It means they are all bound all at the same time, all at once, unless they opt out. So this instrument actually has 196 states parties, even two more than WHO member states, because the Holy See and Liechtenstein joined this. This one has 182. This one, to give you an example of what's not legally binding, this is called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework. It's also thick. You can do thick things with a non-binding resolution, and that's in Article 23. So Those are the three options. The first two are legally binding. The third one is not. And member states will have the say by the end of July on what this pandemic instrument should be. And you have a chance, everyone will have a chance to have a say on what they think should be in it and whether it should be legally binding at these public hearings on April 13th, 12th and 13th, which is also something we don't ordinarily do, but also falls under this same preamble paragraph. Informed and active engagement by the public and by CSOs who are such important public servants in that sense. So thanks very much, Theresa.
Yeah, thanks to you for giving us an insight into the legal framework and the different options that are on the table. I particularly like the invitation to switch off Netflix and join the pandemic treaty discussion, which is a bit nerdy, but I think that's yeah, I think we really appreciate that. And now I would like to come back to the compliance point. We already have learned that the weakness of many international treaties is compliance and enforcement. So Björn, I would like to ask you, what are your considerations on this aspect and which body would monitor the implementation of the treaty? What would you think about that?
So thanks a lot, Theresa. And you're absolutely right. One could pose the question, so what's the value of international treaties if there's no compliance mechanism and enforcement mechanism? And I think that's certainly an issue that has been learned by the international or by the global community, well, after having adopted many of those international treaties with no compliance and enforcement mechanism. One of them, unfortunately, is the IHR, the International Health Regulations, which so far doesn't really foresee a key compliance mechanism and enforcement mechanism. So many refer to the IHR, while they are obviously of utmost importance as a toothless tiger, I would say. And there are ongoing debates to negotiate or to implement a compliance and enforcement mechanism for the IHR and link to that also for the pandemic treaty. Obviously, it's hard to predict the future and what member states will commit to. One of the key aspects that have been already in the debates is how much state sovereignty will member states be willing to provide to more or less a global mechanism. Because in the end, it comes down to that. You have to provide and you have to practically be flexible enough to give your state sovereignty in a specific case away for an enforcement and compliance mechanism. Obviously, there is the idea to have a state party of once the pandemic treaty has been adopted, you will have a conference of the parties to more or less oversee the establishment and enforcement and compliance of this. But is that enough? That's the big question. In the IHR, we realized that we need more. There is this current exercise of setting up a universal health periodic review mechanism. It's interesting to note that this idea came already up after the Ebola crisis in West Africa. I think it was one of the UN panels, the Kikwete panel, that came up with this idea, which is a striking idea and which is practically a stolen idea from the human rights treaty monitoring bodies to establish practically a review mechanism where member states will have to be peer reviewed on how they have implemented and enforced, in this case, the IHR, the International Health Regulations. And then it's practically an open debate about deficits and what the member state would do in order to address those shortcomings. I think it's fair to say that no enforcement mechanism will work unless there are also incentives. And I think the pandemic treaty is a very interesting mechanism in order to link incentives with obligations. And I think if we are able to link both in incentives and obligations, then we are not deemed to fail. I fear that if we're just focusing on potentially sanctions, so obligations, then member states might not be tempted to approve something in the end, a tough mechanism. So rather, there needs to be this buy-in from all member states, and it can be something different to China than it is to Malawi, than it is to Germany, etc. But all member states need to get something out of signing up to this treaty, and it will be more than just saying yes, we will be secured from a next crisis. I guess, and I think that will be the tricky and the interesting debate that we will be having throughout the next 2 years.
Linking incentives and obligations, that was a nice wording. I will keep that in mind. And to the audience, remember that you can ask questions in the chat. We will have the Q&A in a few minutes. But now that we know more about the legal environment, let's speak about the content of the pandemic treaty a bit. So I would like to ask Stephen, what will be the main thematic areas of the treaty based on discussions that you participated in so far, and which areas might be relevant that cannot be addressed only by the health sector?
Thanks for that. I'm going to address that, but if I could, Theresa, with your permission, as our facilitator moderator, just compliment what Björn said about linking obligations, incentives, and compliance. Could I just add a word about that? I think that's the importance of that cannot be overstated. It's so important to think about compliance much more broadly than in the past. Let me illustrate that by telling you about the dispute settlement mechanism in the IHR and in the FCTC, because they share them.
Steve, you have to speak to the microphone because it's
okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Is this
good,
better?
Good to know it's not only me. Yes.
Is this better?
Come
Is
a
this
bit
better?
closer.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So I think Björn's definitely ears picked up when I talked about complimenting Björn with my statement. I'd like to. But honestly, I think the importance of this idea of linking obligations and incentives to think more broadly about compliance than we have traditionally, because traditionally it's been a sort of a kind of a model of force rather than a model of incentives. And I think it's really important. Let me illustrate this by telling you what we can learn from instruments just in the ones we've mentioned, because both the IHR and the FCTC in their dispute settlement articles have an option for compulsory arbitration. So when parties join these instruments, they can have a choice to opt into a compulsory arbitration system for any dispute. The FCTC has this, the IHR has this. The number of state parties of 196 that have taken advantage of this, number of countries that have said, yeah, this compulsory arbitration thing, that's a good tool, we should do that. The number of countries that have decided that is exactly zero. Same provision exists in the FCTC, and that's, both of these are very recent things. And the number of countries of 182 that have decided that this compulsory arbitration will sign up for that is two out of 182. So we need to think more creatively. And I'm reminded of studies in terms of looking at behavioral science aspects of regulations, which is a field that has really developed very fruitfully in the last couple of decades, which can be, I think, usefully applied. As an example and illustration of this, compliance is not just a problem in international law. Compliance is also a problem in domestic law and in local jurisdictions. We all know about the 30-kilometer speed limit in villages, but we have all seen two things that promote compliance. Villages and local jurisdictions obviously can punish offenders. They can issue tickets, but issuing a ticket after someone speeds through a small village at 40 kilometers per hour instead of 30 kilometers is too late. You've already endangered kids in the village. You don't want to promote compliance always by sanctions. So what do villages do? And we've all seen this. They do at least two kinds of things. One, they put in speed bumps So there's an incentive to comply. The incentive is you don't ruin your car if you stay within 30K in a village. And the other way, and this is also a behavioral science issue, they show your speed. We've all seen this, where your speed is displayed. And if you are going over 30, you get an angry face. And if you're going under 30, you get a smiley face. That little addition of adding the small reward and the small social approbation of an angry face apparently increases compliance with observation of those speed limits. We can take lessons from this in building a new instrument and apply this and have an even smarter way of promoting international cooperation and international compliance with an instrument like this. That was a long thing, so I'll be short about what can be on the substance here. There's really kinds of 4 things we're looking at, or I should say 4 by 4. One dimension is we are looking in terms of technical issues at preparedness, at prevention, at response, and resilience. And in terms of political pillars, we're looking at 3 things: at governance, international governance systems, at overall systems and tools, pathogen sharing, etc., and at financing. So in overall strategic way, we're looking at governance systems and financing, all of which is based on principles of equity, inclusivity, and coherence. So at the center of all those strategic pillars, if you will, it's based on equity, inclusivity, and coherence. And that gets to Björn's point about the importance of legal clarity. Really, really important. It's got to be clear or it's just hard to follow.
Thank you for this detailed explanation. I really like the comparison with the speed limit, especially interesting here in Germany, where we don't have a speed limit, and it's a really explosive debate. It's also interesting considering behavioral psychology, I guess. But now the last question to Björn before we start the Q&A. Since you are our finance expert, I would like to ask you if there have been proposals on how to go about this, and if financing for pandemic preparedness and response will be a central pillar of the negotiating and the treaty itself.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure whether I'm really the financing expert, at least for WHO I might be. I think overall, that's a fair question. And that is certainly one thing that I've been saying to the members of the working group that I have the honor and pleasure to chair. So the working group on sustainable financing. And that is that the treaty discussions and the IHR discussions and many of the other discussions don't make any sense unless we equip, the multilateral organizations adequately for the task that we put on their shoulders, in addition to what they are in charge of anyhow already. So practically, through the pandemic treaty, we will burden member states potentially, but also the Secretariat, so the WHO, to do lots of things. And unless we provide the finances, it doesn't make any sense to approve a new treaty and create new regulation. I think there are ongoing debates about financing for preparedness, pandemic preparedness and response, ongoing, and we see that everywhere. We see that within WHO, where the emergency program, the only international organization that has an implementing capacity for health emergencies, is chronically underfunded. We realized that the contingency fund for health emergencies, which was created after the West African Ebola crisis in order to provide the WHO with upfront funding so it would not have to beg donors to start fighting more or less against the fire before it becomes a global crisis. That contingency fund remains chronically underfunded. It's practically at zero because of also the Ukraine crisis, where again we are in severe need for financing for WHO. We are having debates of other international organizations that are using more or less the pandemic preparedness and response issue in order to raise funding for their replenishments. And there is also this idea that has been promoted by the IPPPR, but that has been now promoted by the US and Norway to establish a new financing facility for pandemic preparedness and response, with originally foreseen an overall budget of 10 billion per year only for that function. But it's also true that within the pandemic treaty, there has been this idea and debate about shouldn't we also include the financing aspects in this treaty? And I think that's ongoing, and it remains to be seen how we are linking these efforts, legal obligations, incentives, with the ongoing ideas to ensure a better financing for pandemic preparedness and response functions. And I think they need to be linked. I think and that's also fair to say, the improvement and strengthening of the IHR, but also the broader member states' obligations with regards to pandemic preparedness and response will not make any sense unless they are linked with financial incentives. And I think there are great possibilities to link both. These idea about a new fifth, this financing facility, linking that to the IHR implementation, the Universal Health Periodic Review mechanism, but it needs to be linked in order not to end up in a situation that we are all trying to more or less avoid. What I've been saying in many of these fora, including my working group, is this is one of the most exciting times for global health that at least I can oversee the last 10 years. Why? Because practically in a very short period in time, global health governance, and in particular with regards to pandemic preparedness, is being re-established, reshaped, and practically it's in our hands whether this makes sense in the end or not. So compared to pre-COVID times, we have to make sure that post-COVID, global health architecture is less fragmented, better coordinated, offers less duplication, less complexity, I would say, is better coordinated. I mentioned that already, better financed, and certainly more effective. And my final word, more and truly inclusive. And I think those are the key pillars that we need to judge our decisions on. And with that, over to you, Theresa.
Thank you, Björn. We will now move into the Q&A with the audience. So let me see what questions have come in. We also got from Maike Voss from the German Alliance on Climate Change and Health, a policy brief on the pandemic treaty, and we got some other questions. For example, Stephen, you are asked if you could develop a bit more about the public hearings on the 12th and 13th of April. So when will you release more information about the public hearings? Will they be virtual? Will there any opportunity to participate in person?
So yeah, thanks for that question. They will be virtual. They will be facilitated by the WHO Secretariat. They will be over 2 days, probably 3 2-hour sessions each day. There will be 2 avenues. One avenue will be for written submissions, and that will be open to anybody, anywhere. And the other avenue will be for all oral presentations, which will be 2 minutes. And we intend to put this on our website about how to register for that. To register for the oral testimony, the opportunity to provide an oral statement of 2 minutes, we will require registration. It will have to be of some entity rather than just a member of the public for the 2 minutes, and that's purely for reasons of there just aren't enough 2-minute segments to make sure we get everyone. But all this will be outlined and placed on our website, and then through the various stakeholder communities, we hope that the issues will be networked. So various stakeholder communities, CSO community, the private sector, academic and philanthropic communities, the expert communities, and that we, in that way, will be able to get a very good cross-section and good sampling of oral views. But again, we'll be receiving written views from anyone, anywhere.
Thank you. We got another question from Neil Vora. I hope I pronounced that in the right way. If not, I'm sorry. Speaking about the importance to prevent pathogen emergence in the first place, so pandemic prevention. And the question is actually, how can the pandemic treaty be used to address upstream drivers of pathogen emergence, such as wildlife trade and deforestation? I'm not sure who of you would like to answer that question.
Björn?
Okay.
I mean, I'm happy to compliment again, but please.
That's wonderful, Steve. So I think among the contents, broad themes that I also Steve has already mentioned, obviously equity, IHR, data sharing, virus sharing, finance governance. There's obviously the one big pillar, which is One Health. And I think the question obviously drives at One Health. Well, certainly we need to be clear with regards to what is to be expected from this treaty in the end. I think it will not more or less address all challenges that we are seeing, but the linkage in between the various different sectors in the sense of the One Health approach is certainly one that is, I think, clear to the majority of member states that have so far participated in this process. So I would say it will be addressed. In the end, I mean, nobody knows how successful the process will be. I mean, it's an ongoing process. It will be a long process, and 194 member states will decide throughout the negotiations what is then consensual and what potentially is not, where we don't reach a consensus. Maybe one or two things in order to complement what Steve has already said with regards to civil society involvement. I think there are different ways, and I know that the WHO sometimes is being blamed for not adequately engaging with civil society. I think there are two ways of doing that in processes that are steered in Geneva through the WHO. The one possibility is through the WHO, and here we are seeing that the Secretariat and WHO reaches out to civil society, obviously in a specific targeted manner, and one could question whether 2 minutes are enough or not. But certainly this is a learning exercise for the Secretariat. But the second avenue certainly is through member states, such as the German one, Germany. And as I mentioned at the start of this webinar, it's a clear German priority in global health to engage with civil society. We do that on a frequent basis. Certainly through COVID and virtually, it's not such a huge pleasure as meeting in person, but we as the Health Ministry have in the past organized broader meetings on global health. I think the Global Health Hub, Germany is certainly a creation in order to engage even more on a frequent basis. We will do so again, most likely in June, hopefully, if the virus allows us to meet in person. So I think we, as the German government, and I'm sure also other member states and the Secretariat, is keen to learn from civil society and the broader global health players, where they see the opportunities and challenges for a pandemic treaty, what they believe needs to be shaped and established as concepts, and then obviously thriving towards a consensus of member states. And I think there, often member states need to be, well, the member states thinking needs a little refreshment from the broader global health players. One key challenge that I see is that much of the input here, be it from civil society, but also from within member states, comes obviously from health experts. Yeah, and these health experts, unfortunately, have seen themselves, like ourselves, in a crisis, a huge crisis, and practically on a day-to-day work, fighting against this crisis now for the last 2.5, 3 years. And I see a fatigue of, and I see that in an ideal world, we would have a break, all take a year vacation, and then come back again and come with fresh thinking and say, this is what needs to come into a new pandemic treaty, a new legally binding instrument. But unfortunately, we are fighting time here. We are fighting more or less losing the political momentum for real change, because practically after a crisis, that's the moment where you are able to change member states' thinking, yeah, because they are still more or less, they have in the back of their minds still this feeling of huge crisis which they want to avoid in the future. And in that moment, member states are hopefully ready to take bold decisions. But in a year's time from now, or potentially in 2 years from now, I doubt that that will be possible again. So we are practically we are facing the challenge that on the one hand, the colleagues who need to provide their input and their expertise into this process, they are covering an ongoing crisis and they are completely out of any further resources. And on the other hand, once they might have time to, I don't know, more time to come refreshed to the political scene, they potentially, the political momentum would have vanished by then. And that's the challenge, to align both, I think.
Thank you. Stephen, would you like to say anything more about that, or should I go on?
Just one sort of alphabet soup reference, and then I'll explain why this is not just speaking bureaucratese. So in addition to WHO, we are involving FAO, OIE, and UNEP in this work. And these, sort of a one health oriented approach. What this means when we involve all those is we get not only experts, but the stakeholders from each of those communities making the case for how important the One Health approach is. We've really, the global public understands so much better than it did 2.5 years ago what the concept of pathogen spillover from natural reservoirs means. And engaging all these communities and all these engaging these organizations and their community stakeholders is a way to empower the thinking that's already gone into how to address that. And yes, it should be part, and I think it will be part. And for those who believe that, again, public hearings, that should be part of this this instrument, this possible treaty. And it all doesn't have to be done right away. The idea of a framework convention or a framework instrument is you build an overall vehicle and then you fill in these specific parts later over time, but you don't lose the momentum, which Björn was talking about. Very a critical aspect of this. Political will can shift very quickly and can evaporate very quickly. And seizing that is going to be a very important part of this 2-year process.
Thank you, Stephen. So now we have still 20 minutes of discussion left. So if you have any question, please ask it in the chat. And Andreas Wolf from Medico International raised a really interesting question. He's asking, could a pandemic treaty contain regulations of waiving intellectual property regulations for products in the case of a pandemic? That's a really hotly contested issue at the World Trade Organization right now. Is it realistic to get it into the pandemic treaty as well? Maybe Stephen, first to you and then to Björn.
So thanks. Great question, and lets me segue off of the point I just made to say that, again, a framework approach to an agreement, to a convention or an agreement or an instrument allows for exactly that, allows to address the critical issue of IP and the barriers that it can impose on access to essential medicines, and in the case of a pandemic, access to life-saving vaccines and therapeutics and countermeasures. So very much could be a part of it. And I think member states will be watching and following very closely what's happening in the WTO to see how that the concept of an IP waiver is taken forward. There'll be a lot of attention to the issue of TRIPS flexibilities and where their use is problematic, which is leading to the pressures for a IP waiver at the WTO. And all of these provide lessons learned for member states as they begin to formulate ideas for a pandemic treaty or instrument. You'll notice I always use the phrase, by the way, pandemic treaty or instrument, because as part of the Secretariat, although the DG, the Director General, supports a treaty, the Secretariat is also in the business of supporting member states. And as I said at the beginning, member states haven't reached a decision on what it's going to be yet. That comes in July. So hence the care I take in using both those terms. So the answer in short is yes, it very much can be. It depends on the will of member states. But I think there's an increasing willingness to take this complex issue on and do so in collaboration with our relevant sister agencies and stakeholders.
Thank you, Stephen. Maybe Björn, would you also like to elaborate more on the topic of IP regulations and Germany's position on that?
I think there's not much to be added from what Steve said. I think it's quite, I mean, from the outset, it's clear that this is a complex issue, and I think everybody can subscribe to that. It's a tricky issue. It's also a tricky issue for, I think, the German government. That's fair to say. I think it's also clear that in the end, everything depends on the will of member states. From our assessment or my assessment, it's also clear that equity will be one of the key pillars in what form whatsoever. It's true that the TRIPS waiver is hotly debated, obviously in various fora, but but the key forum for the discussion of the TRIPS waiver is certainly in the WTO. And I would doubt that if there is a definite decision taking place in the WTO, that then in another forum there would be another discussion or a renegotiating of what has already been decided in the era of the WTO, because then obviously it wouldn't make sense to discuss this in one forum. So let's see what the outcome will be. In order, and certainly there is no will from member states to do something that I would call, I'm not sure whether that's the right term, forum hopping from one forum to the next, to the next, to the next. But certainly I think we all agree that this is highly complex and that this is certainly one of the most difficult issues, and that equity needs to be adequately included in the pandemic treaty. And that's also what we hear from obviously many of the other member states, partner member states in developing countries, that they have clear expectations with regard to ensuring equity.
Thank you, Björn. Next comes Maike Voss. She says she has a trillion of questions, but she's just asking two. The first one is, what is the concrete problem a new legal pandemic treaty can solve? So maybe you can be a bit more precise on that, Stephen or Björn. And also how to ensure that a variety of states engage with the development and negotiation of the treaty. So that is important to keep in mind who's in the room and who's not, and how can capacities also restrict the negotiations? Maybe who wants to start?
I'm happy to jump in on a concrete example. I get front and center is the fact that the world is not sharing access to vaccines, countermeasures, and therapeutics the way it should. We have a major sharing problem. And it shouldn't just be about sharing, actually, because it shouldn't be about the old 20th century model of global health as a charity model. Let me go back to my example of, incentives with my speed bumps, if I can. And this may be stretching it, and you and your audience will tell me if I'm stretching it. But if the idea of a speed bump is to enforce, to help promote a rule that you can't speed, and you do that by putting bumps in the road so you can't speed. The idea of having a rule where you have to share can also be incentivized by making it very difficult to hoard vaccine. So if you have a global industrial policy for vaccine manufacturing, for example, where you decide that it's very important as a public health matter to let the drivers of where you place vaccine manufacturing be public health considerations rather than profit or geopolitical considerations, then the speed bump equivalent here is you can put vaccine manufacturing in small population countries well distributed around the world. So for example, you put vaccine manufacturing that is supported globally in countries with populations of less than around 10 or 15 million. That way they can't not share, because if they're producing at a high rate, they have to begin to distribute that regionally. This is the idea of bringing together, marrying the rules and the incentives so that they work synergistically. But if you allow, instead of public health policy considerations, if you allow other considerations to drive where these mRNA facilities will be built in the future exclusively, if you allow profit considerations, geopolitical considerations, you're not going to get an optimal global public health result. And an instrument, a collectively supported and a collectively negotiated instrument that can promote that kind of policy-oriented decision-making can help address this most important aspect of preparedness and response to the next pandemic when it comes. So that's one example.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Mike was also asked how it is possible to guarantee that also all states can be engaged or can participate in the process. Could you elaborate a bit more on that, maybe? And then we move on to the next question from Mariska.
Sure. So there are 194 countries that are member states of WHO, and what the Health Assembly set up is called an open-ended intergovernmental negotiating body. And in this case, open-ended is UN speak for every single country gets to be there and gets an opportunity to be heard and has the same right as every other country to participate and to contribute to the decision making. So it is open to all countries, and even for those countries that aren't yet members of WHO for one reason or another, they can come as observers. So it is truly a global process, expanded upon by the fact that it's also involving relevant stakeholders, which is another a big part of the universe. So it's and as we've seen from the pandemic, how affected so many sectors are, so many everywhere. This is a very, very important aspect.
Thanks. So the next question from Mariska Meurs, I hope I say that right. It is about meaningful participation of civil society in communities. I think you can both try to shortly answer this question with the perspective of Germany and the perspective from WHO. So what's your view on the need to tackle the fundamental differences between civil society and the private sector, and then keeping problematic industry actors out of treaty making? So it's about competing interests also and about civil society engagement. Maybe Björn, you could start on this.
Yes, of course. So in the WHO scenery, there is this famous regulation, which is called FENSA, which practically clarifies how WHO, at least the Secretariat, is allowed to engage with everybody who's not a member state. And I think FENSA has been criticized for not having differentiated enough between civil society, private sector, but it certainly takes care of some highest problematic industry actors, which in FENSA was tobacco and arms industry. From a German point of view, as I mentioned, there are different ways of ensuring that civil society is being heard. That is through public hearings, that is through public hearings that WHO does, but it's also through non-public hearings. So the German government, through the various ministries has frequent debates with civil society groups on various global health issues involving obviously also the topic of the pandemic treaty. And we would highly appreciate if civil society reached out to us proactively and told us what they believe, what the prospects and what issues should be tackled within a pandemic treaty. So to be well informed and to understand better the perspective of civil society. So I think this comes from both ends. Whether I would share that only civil society and not private sector should be heard, I think the German government wouldn't agree to that. I think we need to be clear about the fundamental differences in between sectors, and certainly that there are specific interests always involved, depending on who you are, whether you're representing a company, an industry, a foundation, or a grassroots civil society organization, or a civil society organization that has only one specific mandate and tries to make sure that that mandate and constituencies' interests are included. So I think much depends on transparency in this regard and knowing who presents which interests. But I think we have certainly an interest in hearing all voices, all perspectives, but understanding and in full recognition who brings which interests and which position. I think it's fair to say that the WHO is not the Secretariat. Yeah? The WHO is the Secretariat and member states, and the member states to some extent dictate what the Secretariat and who the Secretariat can engage with. Indeed, there are different processes where member states allow civil society and the private sector to engage, and potentially this is also something that I can take with to Geneva, that we need to be even stronger advocating for meaningful engagements. I think there are ongoing debates also outside just the mere focus on the pandemic treaty, ensuring that non-state actors meaningfully engage with the WHO. But I think it's a learning exercise on both ends.
Thanks, Björn. Would you like to add something, Stephen?
Just to hold up this again, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, civil society played an enormous role in the elaboration and now in the implementation of the FCTC. So I think there are really important and useful lessons to learn from those organizations which still play such an active and important role in tobacco control, for how civil society that is involved with PPRR issues, which preparedness, prevention, response, and resilience, how civil societies can work based on these very important lessons learned in FCTC. And it certainly makes for a much richer and a much more effective instrument of the FCTC. And I think the same will be true of any instrument that comes out of this process.
Thank you. So the next question is about strengthening the IHR, which is also an ongoing project within WHO. So I will direct that question to Stephen as well. How can WHO facilitate that member countries comply with the IHR? The regulations require that all countries have the ability to detect, assess, report, and respond to public health events.
There are a number of streams of work on this right now. And one stream is to amend the IHR itself. The US has proposed a raft of amendments to do just that. There's the expectation just recently announced that the Russian Federation will make proposals for amendments to the IHR. The European Union might. All of these are directed to strengthening the IHR. But I think the other avenue is it's not necessarily the case that to strengthen it, you have to amend it. I think that's clear in some areas. There are gaps. This has been pointed out by the IHR Review Committee, which prepared a report on this, which is publicly available. But there are also things that the Secretariat can do, by way of better informing the state's parties and stakeholders in how the instrument works, by strengthening the communities and networks of those who implement the IHR. I'll give one illustration of this and then I'll stop. So every state part of the IHR has to have what's called a national focal point. That is someone in each country who's responsible, and generally, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, to be by the proverbial IHR phone in case there's an event that needs to be reported or responded to. But there has been, since the IHR was established, no regular meeting of these national focal points to exchange best practices, to get to know each other, to strengthen their bonds as community members, which would strengthen trust among them and confidence in sharing the information. And the Secretariat doesn't need an amendment to say, you know what, let's get the national focal points of all 196 states parties together every other year. Let's have them meet. Let's have them discuss best practices. Let's improve this very, very important aspect of the IHRs.
Thank you. So we have about 3 minutes of discussion left. And the next question comes from Jan de Tering from the German Bundestag, the parliament. He's interested in the possibilities and challenges of potential sanctions of a pandemic treaty. Is it really an option to introduce sanctions, or would it hamper the whole process of member states joining a potential agreement? I would pose this question to Björn, and if you would like to add something, Stephen, feel free.
Yep, thanks a lot for that question. No, I think it's fairly unrealistic that there are sanctions included. I don't see that. Obviously, there are other, policy regimes in other policy areas where sanctions are being applied. But to be fair, I doubt that, a meaningful number of member states would be willing to approve a pandemic treaty with a severe sanction regime. I rather believe that it's less sanctions and more incentives based, or soft sanctions. Let's put it this way: not even a real naming and shaming, but practically something that, as I mentioned, something like this UHPR, Universal Health Periodic Review mechanism, where member states practically have to explain potentially why they haven't complied or why they haven't implemented something. And openly, potentially even explain this to a broader audience, which can be quite stressful for member states, and make them more willing to implement and comply in the future. But obviously then, if severe compliance deficits or implementation deficits persist, the question comes up, well, some member states might not have the capacities to implement the provisions due to lack of financing. And this is what I meant, where I see the link with a new financing facility for pandemic preparedness and response, that if you adequately link both such a compliance mechanism or assessment mechanism, where you have these peer reviews and you assess deficits in compliance and implementation with financial incentives, then I think that's the way to go in the future. And that also would ensure a better compliance, a better coordination in between the various relevant actors, be it WHO, the World Bank, where the financing facility, at least when it comes to the US and Norway, would be hosted. To me, that could make sense to link both in such a way. But to a large extent, not sanctions, but rather incentive based.
Perfect. Thank you so much. If Stephen would not like to add anything on this, I will continue with a question from Bernd Appelt. He's asking, will there be references in the pandemic treaty on how to ensure that relevant vertical actions are not weakening health systems, but rather contribute to making health systems more resilient and thus contributing to universal health coverage? I would direct that question to Stephen.
Yes, thanks. And the resilience of health systems is, as I mentioned, in the double P, double R, the second R after response and resilience. So I think the there will be a great deal of attention to that. It is health systems, including and especially down to the community level, that have shown themselves to be so effective in the COVID response, but indeed are essential at all times. So I think this will be a major focus of the work to produce a treaty or an instrument.
So the second last question comes from Bettina Borisch. At the FCTC, civil society organizations had far more possibilities to collaborate. How do we see the collaboration after the 12th and 13th April public hearing? That's a good question. Stephen, would you like to answer that?
Sure. So we're planning we'll be planning a second set of public hearings, probably before July. Again, we haven't set the date for that yet. I should say that WHO has only done these kinds of public hearings once. That was with the FCTC. So this is learning it as we build it, but it was a mandate from the special session. We're very happy to have this mandate. Then there is always the possibility for, as Björn has already mentioned, for civil society organizations to work through their own governments and to work with other organizations which may already be in official relations with WHO. And that is another possible pathway for participation and engagement.
Thank you. So the last question for the Q&A comes from Timothy Visonga, and he's asking, has conducting of joint external evaluation influenced compliance of the IHR? I think maybe, Stephen, you would also like to answer that question, and Björn, if you would like to add something, feel free.
I think the answer is, in a word, yes, and I think the answer and the why for that is what Björn has already touched upon. In a sense, it's a soft or a social sanction for not living up to even one's own country's expectations, but certainly in terms of the international community, regional or other or larger, there's a desire on the part of states to have a good report, as it were, on that. And so I think that's been can be a very useful aspect of JEE and other similar arrangements.
And I come in to complement that. The interesting thing with the JEEs is certainly that they are purely on a voluntary basis. So practically there's no, member states are not put under pressure to undergo a JEE. So indeed, not all member states have done that. And I'm not sure how many JEEs have been done in the end, but I would doubt that it's more than half of WHO's member states have done it. And there could be also a good reason, because obviously if I'm a member state and I comply perfectly well with the IHR, then it's great for me to do a JEE and being seen as having lots of nice text practically. Yes, I've performed well and I can show off with that. But while I potentially haven't complied and implemented the IHR core capacities, then potentially I'm also not willing to do a joint external evaluations. And that is certainly why we are lobbying in favor of the new mechanism, which I see more or less as a new mechanism instead of the JEs, the Universal Health Periodic Reviews, as hopefully at some stage mandatory for all member states. Because if we are just evaluating those who already are committed to IHR compliance and implementation, then we are not performing well in the end.
Perfect. Thank you to everyone, to the audience, for all those exciting questions. I hope I've not overlooked any. And for the next minutes, I would like to speak about the next steps and a bit more about non-state actor involvement. So we already heard a bit about the time frame of the pandemic treaty. My question would be, when will the pandemic treaty expectedly be a reality? Stephen, could you answer the question, or is it not possible?
Well, we can give you what the Health Assembly has mandated to the Intergovernmental Negotiating Body, which is the Health Assembly wants an outcome, that's the word they use, by May 2024, the 77th World Health Assembly, May 2024. So again, key date, treaty, binding or not, August by July 2022, and then outcome of whatever the process is by May 2024.
May 2024, so save the date. Let's speak a bit more about the role of Europe. Europe has been a strong player during the pandemic, and I wonder what role do you see for the European Union in the negotiation process of the treaty and its subsequent stages? Björn, maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that.
I will do that in a second, but before, obviously, I'm going to compliment what Steve has said. I have the pleasure and honor to chair a working group that was expected to deliver already in January, in past January, a consensus. And because that was impossible, we are still more or less, our mandate has been prolonged. And obviously, we need to be as ambitious as possible. What I would like to practically say here is that May 2024 is ambitious. We should strive for that, and we should remain optimistic. But there are obviously, in a multilateral setting, there are always unpredictable circumstances which could then end up in prolongation of a process. I mean, obviously that is to be avoided, but I just wanted to say that obviously the Assembly can always change its mind and say we need another year. Yeah, but obviously then the tricky part comes in to lose the political momentum. Now, with the role of the EU, I think that's a broader question. I think that the EU has gained more and more an active role, proactive role in global health in the past years, especially throughout this COVID crisis. I think it's certainly a political signal that this initiative, at least to 50%, came from Charles Michel. So it was driven by European players. There's a strong European voice in here. The EU itself will come with a coordinated voice to the table to many of these aspects, in particular, obviously, those where we have a European competence. So I think that in the future, we will see more and more, well, a stronger European role overall, which I think is good. It's good for many reasons. I think there are two turning points for the EU's role in global health. The first is already a couple of years behind us, which was Brexit, where losing one highly competent member state and well coordinated member state in the EU was obviously a challenge, and making sure that the EU, the remaining 27 member states, need to rethink how they engage in global health. And the second one practically is the ongoing crisis in the Ukraine, which, from my assessment, will lead to a stronger role in the EU, of the EU in many policy areas, but certainly not limited to defense, but potentially also many of the other policy sectors, and global health is one of them, where we want to make sure that we are seen as one, well, group that has principles, that has a specific role, a specific approach and specific expertise, and brings that to the best of all.
Thanks. Stephen, would you like to add something, or can I continue? Perfect. I have another question actually also to you, Björn. Maybe you can give us a little insight about the coordination within the German state or the health ministry, because to form the substantive elements of the pandemic treaty, member states will be asked to provide the recommended categories or components via an online tool between 21st of March and 29th of April 2022 this year. So how is Germany coordinating its input? What are the core categories and components currently discussed in the politics?
Okay, so indeed, we are proactively engaging in the pandemic treaty. As I mentioned from the start, there are two ministries in the lead, Health and Foreign Affairs, but we are coordinating with all ministries, obviously Ministry of Development Cooperation, but also others. like research, economics, justice, etc. They all come in, also obviously with areas that we've already touched upon because they are so complex, like the IP rights and TRIPS waiver, equity, One Health, IHR, etc. So we are coordinating, we are trying to use also the pandemic treaty to really rethink global health and pandemic preparedness and see what specific interests we can bring into the treaty. Obviously, for each member states, there are always two positions. You can block something, a position that you don't want to have in a treaty, and you can do it proactively. You can try to shape something constructively. And certainly our hope is that we are doing the latter, namely to bring lots of expertise, German interests into the paper where we believe we can really make an added value. This is an ongoing exercise. I mentioned one of the key challenges. There are so many different and parallel streams currently with the IHR strengthening process, the financing processes, be it in WTO, but also beyond. We have certainly the WGPR, so the Working Group on Pandemic Preparedness and Response. On top of that, with lots of other ongoing, with an ongoing crisis currently, where also health aspects are obviously in. And we have the pleasure and honor to host the G7. So this is certainly not a relaxing time, but rather a challenging time for coordination. But we are doing our best. We still have a couple of weeks to go. We have coordinating rounds with all relevant ministries involved, and we've done that from the start. We had our last meeting, I think, a week ago. We are coordinating the positions, and that's ongoing. At this stage, we've sent out a note to all ministries for positioning on specific aspects, so we can come with a strong voice and a coordinated voice to Geneva for all the relevant meetings that will take place then in April and from then onwards. But I think what we also need to understand is that this is a moving target. Yeah. So it's not like the German government sits back in a room and we decide this is what we want to have in the treaty and this is what we don't want to have in the treaty, and that's it. And we open the door and go to Geneva and come with that coordinated position, because that wouldn't make any sense, because in the end we don't know whether that is something that we can get through or into the treaty in the end. So we always have to adapt to obviously what our partner member states bring to the table, new aspects, potentially new ideas. And then we need to adapt to this learning exercise.
Wonderful, thank you. So that were really valuable insights from the two of you in the next steps of the development process. And I would like now to use the remaining minutes for a last closing round with you. As we are in the beginning of the development process still, I would like to ask the Aladdin and the Magic Lamp question. So if you had 3 wishes for the International Pandemic Treaty, including its development process, what would they be? Try to be precise. You have 3 wishes. Stephen, if you wish, you can start.
Well, first, building on what this entire opportunity has been, which is so appreciated, is that it will be an avenue for public engagement over generations on dealing with global health emergencies, preparedness for them, prevention of them, response to them, and ensuring resiliency. So for public. The second is that it will be a dynamic and living instrument that will be future-proofed. We are entering a world that technologically and politically is moving at dizzying speeds, and that it will be structured in a way that can allow for that kind of flexibility. And the third is that this instrument, this treaty or instrument, will be will provide some form of structured engagement, particularly in difficult geopolitical times, when the world is experiencing a degree of polarization, which is really historically extraordinary, that it will be, as other treaties have been in other difficult times, a pathway for structured engagement of countries that will need avenues of structured engagement. And we saw this during the height of the Cold War in the 60s and 70s with strategic arms control between the US and USSR. That was a source of structured engagement. I believe the Paris Agreement is also a source of that same, of a structured pathway where competitors or otherwise can and have to continue to engage to build trust and confidence among them in areas of common concern. And that can have a positive spillover effect. And so the third genie, the third wish would be that it can form that kind of a mechanism as well.
Thanks. Björn, what would be your 3 wishes to the genie?
Yeah, it's hard to add anything to what Steve has already alluded to. So I think my first wish would be that we are not losing the political momentum, that we are really using the shrinking window of opportunity at this stage. And by doing so, I think also civil society, so the broader community, practically you all, can really make a difference in upholding the momentum and making sure that your voices are being heard in this overall process. I think the second one is to understand that the pandemic treaty exercise is a huge opportunity for global health and global health architecture, and for ensuring a leading and coordinating role of the WHO in this global health architecture in pandemic preparedness and response. And to me, it certainly is at stake with regards to all the ongoing initiatives left and right of the WHO, and trying to more or less assemble that, making sure that, as I mentioned, global health architecture in pandemic preparedness and response post-COVID is less fragmented, offers less duplication, is more efficient, better coordinated, and truly inclusive, with a strong WHO in the center. And the third one, I think, is an overarching goal, and that is using this process as a symbol not to fail again. And that, I mean, I think that's practically the most likely scenario, that the global health community or global community will fail again, because we've done so after each crisis that we've seen in the past decades, that we were unable to learn and implement the lessons from these crises. And in order not to do that, we really need to do our utmost on all our ends while we are engaged in positions in ministries, but also civil society. And there again, you can make a tremendous difference, I think, in pushing us not to miss this opportunity and truly implement the lessons to be learned while the next crisis is already ongoing. And I think that's key, because the next global health crisis will come, and we should not enter the next one as we entered the last one. That certainly is to be avoided. Nobody knows when it will come, whether that will be in 100 years, 30 years, or I don't know, in 5 years. But we really need to ensure that we are better prepared and don't end up in this, at least from an international point of view, kind of disaster where we see huge inequalities, huge non-coordinated complex issues, unclarity who's in charge of what, and where we again need to reinvent the wheel and come up with something that doesn't really turn well. So really, I think that's the most important to me, trying to, well, be consistent and learn the lessons from this crisis.
Thanks. So let's hope that all those wishes become reality. And thank you very much for your insights, for the stimulating discussions, to our 2 wonderful speakers, to the audience. Also, we are coming to the end of this event. This will not be the end of the discussion on this topic. And now I'm happy to announce that following this webinar, the Global Health Hub Germany would like to take this dialogue a step further by offering you the opportunity to participate in a more in-depth exchange via a 4-item questionnaire in which you can share your ideas, expertise, opinions on the pandemic treaty with us. It will probably be shared tomorrow via email, and the questionnaire will be collected by the Hub, consolidated, and finally sent to the German Ministry of Health to inform them on the priorities and of the concerns of each stakeholder group. It can be answered on behalf of an entire stakeholder group, but also by a single person, so everyone can participate. And as I said, it will be sent out to you after this webinar. You will have around 6 weeks for the completion, and it will be in German, but I hope that won't be a problem. And if you have any more questions or concerns, you can find more information on the website. The link to this has been shared with you in the chat box, hopefully by my colleagues. So today's webinar only offers a starting point for further discussions within this field, and the insights will feed into the development process of the pandemic treaty, hopefully. The organizers of this event today have also prepared a short evaluation of the event that takes you not more than a couple of minutes, and it would be really appreciated if you use the link also in the chat box to provide feedback. And I also would like to inform you about the next webinar hosted by the Global Health Hub Germany, which will take place on Tuesday, the 5th of April at 2 p.m. And it's going to be an exchange between different representatives of the G7 engagement group, so T7, Y7, C7, B7, focusing on the development and access to vaccines and therapeutics. Also, you can find more information about this on the Hub's website. So, dear speakers, dear participants, I thank you very much for the fruitful discussions. I've learned a lot. I've learned that the world is more complex than I sometimes would wish, but anyhow, I'm really happy that we had this discussion today, and I wish that everyone has a good day. I hope that you still get a little bit of sunshine, and stay healthy, stay engaged, and see you next time.